Since time immemorial, Native Americans have represented their world through art. Whether on animal hides or on stone, indigenous Americans recognize their world in the art they created. How would outsiders represent Native Americans to the world beyond America? In the early and mid-1800s, painter George Catlin painted American Indians he saw in person. Beginning with the Mandan and expanding to years of receiving hospitality from numerous tribes in the West, Catlin painted scenes never before seen by the general public, as well as individuals who sat before his canvas. George Catlin, Carl Bodmer, and other artists brought their paints, sketchbooks, and empty canvases into the western region to paint and draw Indian life. They were followed in a later time by artists with the same mission, but with different tools. Artist John Carl Hillers carried neither a paintbrush nor sketchpad to Indian country. He carried a camera. After a military career begun in the Civil War, Hillers was hired to photograph Colonel Powell's exploration of the Grand Canyon. Hillers' documentation of the expedition helped to establish this awe-inspiring landscape as a precious national treasure worthy of protection. This experience also inspired Hiller to photograph indigenous cultures of the American Southwest. Hiller found work as a government photographer. His job was to document this country as it was through photography. This ceremonial group of Hopi or Navajo is preserved by the National Archives. Hillers mostly captured Native Americans and Indian country as they appeared, functioning as a documentarian. At about the same time, photographer Ben Wittick was photographing Indians of the American Southwest. He befriended Apaches and Navajos, those from Hopi and Zuni communities, giving him access to spiritual rites that were normally closed to outsiders. Some of his subjects were notable people like the son of Mangus Coloradus. He won his own notoriety with this picture he took of Apache warrior Geronimo. With the Zuni, Wittick formed close relationships, participating in some religious ceremonies. He was especially obsessed with the snake dance, wherein rattlesnakes were tamed to bring prayers for rain into the earth. At Fort Wingate, Wittick suffered a snake bite from which he later died, as foretold by a Zuni shaman. John C. Grable photographed American Indians on the northern Great Plains. He traveled the West during a time known as the Early Reservation Period. Events like councils with Sioux Indians were recorded with his camera. Graybill captured images of Sioux warriors in South Dakota, where he did most of his work. Graybill spent time with the U.S. Army during this war, producing images of soldiers and their officers. Indian leaders like Bigfoot worked hard to keep peace between the Sioux and the Army. These chiefs counseled with General Nelson Miles, the top commander in the region. Graybill documented this kind of interaction between Native Americans and U.S. officials. He took this image of Devil's Tower and of 70 Indian scouts. This image is anything but ordinary. You see, these Hotchkiss guns were fired at Wounded Knee, igniting tents where Sioux women and children were sleeping, killing hundreds. Days later, Graybill took these images, what's left of Bigfoot's band, and survivors of the Wounded Knee massacre. This image of General Miles and staff reminds us of the general's sharp criticism of the officer who defied his orders and tried to disarm Bigfoot's band, an action that set off the massacre. Photographer William S. Soulet's Western sojourn began in 1870 when he found work at Fort Dodge in Kansas. Soule was a Union officer in the Civil War who was wounded at the Battle of Antietam. Soon after the war was over, Soule headed west, and after an additional year, this time at Camp Supply, Soule moved to Fort Bliss, where he was hired to document the fort's construction. This gave Soule a chance to photograph Comanche, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Caddo Indians. He also photographed Apache and Apache Kiowa and other Native Americans in the region. Soule photographed this Comanche camp, a Comanche chief, and this figure he labeled Comanche in winter. He witnessed and documented activities at the fort, like the drawing of rations at the agency. Soule produced unforgettable portraits of Native Americans in the region: Kicking Bird, Little Raven, Lone Wolf, Bird Chief, Black Hawk, and Caddo George Washington, as well as a Caddo village. For 6 years, Soule photographed and shared images of Native Americans, showing their humanity during great and challenging changes.
Oh, we are way, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we oh, we are, oh, we are, way.
Some of his subjects were important historical figures. White Bear, a Kiowa chief who traveled to Washington, D.C., and met with President Abraham Lincoln. Also known as Satanta, he poses with the medal given him by the president. Satanta was a leader and a major figure in the violent struggles in this area. While Soule captured images of important Native American leaders, like Lone Wolf here, his photo entitled Scalped Morrison is widely distributed, often included in textbooks. Soule's photography is an important documentation of Western Indians at a time of their great struggle to survive an expanding United States of America. The sun dance is a widespread and powerful ritual important to Indian tribes of the Great Plains. The power to unify and heal kept the ceremony alive. It also had the power to capture, at least in the case of a Washington photographer. After seeing the ceremony at the end of the 19th century, this photographer would dedicate his life to capturing the culture of Native Americans in North America before that culture died. His name was Edward Sheriff Curtis, and no one produced more photos, writings, and voice recordings of North American Indians. His family moved to the bustling city of Seattle, and it was there that Curtis became a professional photographer. Curtis spent time on the shores of Puget Sound, always accompanied by his camera. Some Native Americans still lingered here, and some were subjects of photos taken by Curtis. His approach was to create artistic scenes with photography, invoking a time in the past when Indians were more present. One subject on that shore was a Duwamish woman known locally as Princess Angeline. She was a daughter of Chief Seattle. She was happy to pose for Curtis, preferring the silver dollar he paid over digging and selling clams. This photo brought Curtis great notoriety. It was praised and embraced by artists across the world who had hopes of gaining acceptance of photography as artistic expression. Edward Curtis was making a name for himself when he accepted the invitation to be photographer for the Harriman expedition to Alaska. On that expedition, Curtis learned the methods of ethnographic research. But he then went on his own expeditions, using earnings from his photography studio to fund field work. While Alaska had been a great adventure, Curtis traveled south and then east, setting up in the American Southwest. With a wagon load of photography equipment, including heavy glass plates, Curtis indulged his curiosity about Zuni and Hopi communities, spending months forming relationships with the people and capturing images of their rich communal lives. His portrait of this child, entitled Hopi Angel, is part of the Edward Curtis collection in the Library of Congress. Curtis became part of the community where he did his fieldwork, giving him acceptance and access that allowed a rare glimpse into the ritual life of the Pueblos. Curtis also did evocative landscape work, described as creating paintings with his camera, like this view of the ancient pueblo of Acoma. The landscape provided a sense of scale in the old trail at Acoma. Curtis used his camera to document the lives of the people, yet he produced more than photos, writing about the customs and practices of the communities where he lived much of the year. He also produced portraits that brought his subjects to life, very much humanizing them for viewers of his work. It's iconic even today, this grand view of Canyon de Chelly in the heart of Deneta, home of the Navajo. Towering, almost temple-like geology, along with riders made tiny in this grand setting, all traveling on horseback, going where? You may have never heard of Edward Curtis, but chances are you've seen this view. Curtis endeavored to evoke visions of the past, saving what he could of pre-Columbian culture. Native spiritual life was always of interest to Curtis. Navajo sand paintings were central to their healing ways. During his time with the Navajos, Curtis formed relationships with shamans, often called medicine men in that time. The Nez Perce were also a subject of Curtis's work. The Nez Perce were forced into a war with the United States Army, showing prowess and decency during a moving battle of over 1,000 miles. It was left to Chief Joseph to surrender the cold, starving Nez Perce, and when Chief Joseph came to Seattle, Curtis eagerly took this portrait. Curtis spent most of his time in the field and made it possible for people to meet individual Native Americans from the Yuma, Pomo, Nez Perce, Hupa, Klamath, Wishram, Crow, Navajo, Apache, Sioux, Zuni, Snake, Blackfoot, Yurok, Suquamish, Modoc, Comanche, Salishan, Kawiya, Umatilla, Arikara, Yakima, Caddo, Assiniboine, Cheyenne, and many more stunning portraits. Curtis threw himself into his work, photographing portraits and scenes from the lives of his subjects. He was spending more time in the field and less time in Seattle with his family. He was racing against assimilation, desperate to capture the traditional ways of these Native Americans while elders were still alive with their memories and language. While Curtis had no lack of enthusiasm or talent, his finances fell short of his ambitions. It's said that railroad magnate J.P. Morgan refused Curtis's request for financial backing until he saw this photo of Mosa. He agreed to back the project with $75,000 and some conditions. Curtis was to produce 20 leather-bound volumes with ethnographic text and his high-quality photos. No publisher would invest in this, so Curtis would self-publish, financed by selling subscriptions before the work was completed. Morgan's money only covered half of Curtis's field expenses, a wagon and team of horses, cameras and glass plates, developing equipment, and food for his long periods in the field. These conditions were often challenging.
At times, the undertaking was made congenial by our surroundings in beautiful mountain wild, in the depths of primeval forest, in the refreshing shade of canyon wall, or in the homes and sacred places of the Indians themselves. While at others, the broiling desert sun, the sandstorm, the flood, the biting blast of winter lent anything but pleasure to the task.
Each year, Curtis visited the Hopi, determined to participate in the snake dance. Curtis befriended a Hopi shaman who adopted him as a son. This allowed Curtis to participate in the ritual, which involved capturing and bringing snakes into the kiva, where they were tamed with feathers. For many nights, Curtis and the shaman remained here, fasting and sleeping in the kiva with the snakes. Finally, the shaman emerged for the snake dance before the community. Curtis declined to do so for concern about publicity.
Oh, we are way, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we ho, we are, oh, we are, we are, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we ho, we are, oh, we are, oh, we are, oh, we are, we are, we ho, we are.
On the northern plains, the Crow had enjoyed mostly good relations with the United States, and while there were trust issues with the government, many saw reason to welcome Curtis. Edward Curtis had great respect for Native American cultures. He also had respect for those individuals, many of whom were struggling with the reservation era. The mutual respect that ensued opened doors for Curtis beyond the Crow Reservation. It was Crow tribal members who introduced Curtis to Red Cloud of the Lakota Sioux and brought him to the Pine Ridge Reservation, Wounded Knee Massacre Site, and Little Bighorn Valley, where willing Sioux tribal members reenacted the historic battle for Curtis's camera. Curtis produced portraits of notable Crow subjects, including Custer's Scouts, White Man Runs Him, Curly, Two Leggings, and Crow leader Plenty Coues. These Crow tribal members constituted a support team for Curtis, and like many other American Indians, formed deep friendships with him. Curtis spent a great deal of time with the Crow, capturing photos of their lives and culture. With help from Crow tribal members, Curtis documented many aspects of Crow life. They also helped Curtis create artistic images, those which told stories without the need for words. For all the friendship and ease that Native Americans gave him, Curtis lived a grueling life. His son caught scarlet fever and almost died during field work. Curtis never had enough money to pay his expenses, and his wife divorced him. Images of pre-assimilation life became harder to get as clothing and possessions changed appearances, and traditional ways of life were rapidly passing away. Curtis was far from alone in experiencing hardship. Life on reservations was brutal and sometimes deadly for Native Americans. Curtis witnessed so much suffering in California and Oregon that his mission was taking an emotional toll. The process of assimilation cut at the spiritual life as well as the physical life of Native Americans. Seeking indigenous people with less influence from assimilation, Curtis headed north to Alaska and Canada's British Columbia. There he met the Kwakiutl. Steeped in the northern Pacific Northwest culture, Curtis found a rich source of information for his ethnology work, audio recordings, and, of course, photographs. Curtis drove himself on, but the world he sought to capture was rapidly passing away. The solution to this dilemma was to be found further north, to the people of the Arctic. This time, Curtis included his daughter Beth in his fieldwork, an experience she deeply treasured, despite many hardships, dangers, and close calls. Edward and Beth noted how happy and contented the people were, people who had not yet encountered the influence of missionaries. Curtis folded all his field notes and photos into this work, The North American Indian, publishing volumes over the years as his resources and time permitted, and always struggling to pay the people dedicated to this gigantic project. Scattered throughout the 20 volumes were Curtis's pictures of Native American children. Wax cylinders like this one was used by Curtis to record speech and music of the American Indians he visited.
It's so amazing just to see that thing.
Definitely.
Curtis recorded over 2,000 of these during his years in ethnology and photography. In some cases, Native Americans hoping to recover their languages have only this resource. Curtis's work is also valued by Native Americans hoping to bring back ceremonies and religious rituals otherwise lost to time. Curtis widened the knowledge about how Native Americans lived, like in this Apache home. The artistic quality of many of his photos invoked the stories of so many varied tribes and the everyday dramas of when they alone had dominion of the lands they inhabited. Curtis came to be an advocate for the people he studied and photographed, yet he subscribed, as did many, to the disappearing American Indian. While he treasured their pre-contact ways of life, he saw their only future in giving up those ways of life, disappearing as distinct people. Curtis saw the mammoth undertaking through to completion. All 20 volumes contain priceless content, yet this did nothing for his financial situation. By the end, he sold his rights to the North American Indian, and the buyers never really made it widely available. The rigors of this work exhausted Curtis, but he did become close to his children later in life, never becoming wealthy, yet producing a wealth in images and knowledge. With dedicated and inspired artists, the images of Native Americans and their culture became increasingly accurate, a notable feat by non-Indians like Curtis. Yet when would Native Americans themselves produce their own images and tell their own stories? One answer came from a Cree named Richard Throssell. At the age of 20, he moved from Washington State to the Crow Reservation for health reasons. He found an outstanding art environment there. He took lessons from famed Taos painter Joseph Henry Sharp, and he learned photography guidance from Edward Curtis. Throssell evolved to develop his own style in his depiction of Crow Indian life. In less than 10 years, Throssell produced over 1,000 photographs of Crow and other American Indians. As a Native American himself, he was given access and permission to photograph sacred ceremonies and other aspects of Crow culture. His unique work was the capture of Indians caught in the moment, expressing a sense of familiarity not found in the images of non-native photographers. Throssell's body of work has passed into the public domain. He encouraged countless Native Americans to find their artistic voice, and left a priceless treasury of Native American images.